But an anonymous question I got that I thought was fantastic was, and I'm going to read this exactly verbatim: Christians in politics, dot, dot, dot. Does a Christian's belief direct their politics? This is a fascinating question. This is a question that almost certainly will get anybody talking about it in trouble because we're so any political issue these days, you get in trouble for addressing. But one thing I love about this show is that I'm going to say what I think. I'll try to say it in love, and hopefully we can have a discussion about it. Hopefully, this answer will spew follow up questions in future episodes. But Christians in politics. Now, those of you who have listened to this show, some other shows, or know me well, know that I'm not afraid to address politics. I don't think that we should flee from politics as Christians. In fact, I don't think Jesus fled from politics. I don't think the disciples fled from politics. I mean, keep in mind that the people Jesus criticized the most were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which at the time were the religious and political leaders of the time. Rome delegated that authority to the Pharisees and Sadducees, which means that they were political leaders. And Jesus is very harsh with them. Now, the big danger with politics, and this is the big danger with politics, is you cannot let that be your identity. And it's not just politics. Anything other than Christ being your identity is a problem. If your identity is wrapped up in a political affiliation, that's a problem. Personally, I don't like to have a affiliation with politics in the sense that I certainly have strong beliefs. People know my strong beliefs, but I don't like to say, "Hey, I'm a Republican," or "Hey, I'm a Democrat," because then you're associating yourself with essentially an organization of questionable values in most cases. We as believers ought to be involved in the realm of politics in some way, shape, or form. Now, what is that? For example, I don't think you should give a sermon in church about taxes. I don't think that has anything to do with our mission as Christ followers. However, there are certain issues in the church that I'm not going to get into specific issues right now because that's not what the question was about. This is a more broad question. But there are issues in the church that we ought to address. Now, we ought to address them in love, and we ought to address them in a Christ-centered way. And that goes back to the way the original question was worded, which is really good. The question said, does a Christian's beliefs direct their politics? And the answer to that, I think, absolutely is yes. Does Jesus trump your politics? Is the way Dr. Frank Turek put it. And Dr. Frank Turek, full disclosure, gets quite political, to the point where I think sometimes he gets too political, to offer a little bit of criticism of a fellow brother in Christ, I suppose. I think he gets too political sometimes. But I really like Turek. And he put it exactly right. Does Jesus trump your politics? When you're, as a believer, discussing a political issue, whether that's privately or publicly, you ought to always remember to keep Jesus first. Jesus ought to be the center of it. If you're addressing a political issue, you better have a Christ-centered reason for it. Now, full disclosure, I do not fully live up to that. I talk about politics all the time because, frankly, I find it fun. There's like this weird pleasure that we get as human beings from talking about controversial issues. Unfortunately, when things get too controversial, it doesn't go well. Christians have to address certain political issues because the church is inherently political in some cases. One thing that you hear a lot is the separation of church and state. First of all, just from a history perspective, the separation of church and state is not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's nowhere to be found anywhere. That's a good thumbnail picture right there. It's not in there. In fact, that phrase comes from a letter that future President Thomas Jefferson wrote to a Baptist congregation. And what he was referring to was the church, the government being out of the church, not the church being out of the government. We as Christians have to be really careful. Friends, we do not want to be associated with a political ideology. We do not want to be associated with a political party. We want to be associated with Christ and Christ alone. But how did Christ deal with tough issues? He certainly didn't ignore them. He addressed them with love and kindness. But love isn't always just letting everything slide. Love is something that is, we have a very different idea of love in our culture today. Because many Christians believe that the most loving thing we can do is just not talk about politics at all because it causes too much drama. I don't think this is the case. Again, like I said, I think there are some issues that you can talk about, but are not something that needs to be spoken from the pulpit. There are other issues that do. And the question is, what is the loving thing to do? Jesus got righteously angry over many things. He got righteously angry over what was happening in his father's house, in the temple, when he overturned the tables. I think that there are certain issues in the world today that Christians have the right to be righteously angry over. Abortion would be an example of that. He, as a church, ought to be willing to address these issues head on in the most loving way possible. And we, please hear me on this. I've certainly struggled with this. If people think of you first and foremost as a political figure, as someone who's obsessed with politics, that's a problem. And I've certainly struggled with that. People have thought of me for a long time in many ways as someone who's too political, and it's a struggle because you want to be known as a Christ follower first and foremost. And if you're not a believer and you're listening to this, just know that if I am a Christian, everything I do flows from that. And yes, that will include my politics. So as a Christian, politics is downstream from my belief in Christ. Everything I believe about the world, including politics, including the economy, anything involved in that, stems down from my belief in Christ. Because if Christianity is true, there's nothing more important than that, as C.S. Lewis said. Now, if it's false, who cares? And I'll tell you this, my political views on certain issues would definitely change if I wasn't a Christian. And some might say, oh, well, you're bringing your religion into your politics. Yeah, I am. I think it was President Reagan. People make fun of me all the time for bringing up President Reagan, but I think he has good points. He said, all are free to believe or not to believe. All are free to practice a faith or not. But those who believe ought to be free to speak of and act on their belief and apply moral teaching to public questions. That's what I think we ought to do as a church. Because the question is, can you even have laws without morality? I don't think you can. So we as a church ought to be influential in making sure that our laws reflect what is morally right. We don't want to have a theocracy on our hands, that's for sure. Theocracies are bad. We've seen that throughout world history. But we also don't want to hide our values. We don't want to go into politics and hide our values. As a Christian, my values, beliefs in Christ and what he taught carry into everything I say and do. Not just the church. When I leave the church building, my values don't suddenly change. At least they shouldn't. So, does my belief in Christ affect my views on politics? Absolutely it does. It affects everything. The gospel changes everything about you. If you want to know whether you've accepted the gospel, ask yourself this: has my life started to change? Have I felt God working in me? And you may say, well, no. Let me ask you this way then. Have you felt guilt? Have you felt like something is wrong? If you're feeling bad about something you're doing, that means Christ is working on you to say, oh, you ought to change that. That's a good sign. We all get to different journeys and points in our lives, but the gospel radically changes everything about you. Slowly, over time. Sometimes really fast, sometimes slow. But for the most part, it's over time. And the gospel is not an addition to your life. You don't even know what your life is until you have the gospel, to quote my mentor, Pastor Rome. So, yes, Christianity absolutely affects my politics. It affects everything. If Christianity is true, there's nothing more important than that. Hopefully that answers your question. That'll do it for today on What is Truth. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. You can follow this on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You can also follow it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And hopefully you have a great rest of your Friday. God bless.